Okay, welcome everyone. My name is David Laibson. I'm an economist who has not gone viral, I discovered this morning. There's a music video about the economics department at Harvard. Sendel and I are featured as one of 20 co-stars. The music video has 130,000 hits, which is not nearly a billion. So I'm going home with my tail between my legs. So let me introduce our panelists as we go through one at a time. Cass asked us to go with this order. We're going to ask everyone to keep it under 12 minutes so we have some time for conversation afterwards. And I just want to alert people that the schedule that was circulated has a different cast of characters ever so slightly. We're adding Sendel to this panel. So continuing Cass's theme about Oscars, if there were Oscars for Best Director in Behavioral Economics Research, Sendel Mulleinathan, our first speaker, would have won several of them over an absolutely extraordinary career, and the guy's only 40 years old, thereabouts. So we're very, very pleased to have him here today. He's also just retired as the head of the research group in economics at the brand new and highly successful Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in Washington, which is safeguarding all of our credit card and other debt transactions. So Sendel, over to you.
Thank you, David. I hope you'll give me a statue. I just want to talk quickly about some psychology of how others influence us. And I think there are several ways that, others can influence us. The first is just advice. This is a quote just because, I don't know, it seemed like a good idea. A lot of technology is built on this notion. So I go to Yelp for reviews, I pick hotels, I pick books, there's graph search. It turns out Facebook is more useful for things other than stalking people, which I didn't realize. These are all technologies built on the notion that other people can provide us advice in making choices and decisions. There's a little bit of psychology research, or actually quite a bit, on how that can work. So let me just walk you through that. A very nice study is by Dan Gilbert and his co-authors. It's called and The Surprising Power of Neighborly Advice. So in one of the experiments in that study, they're going to have one person engage in speed dating with a bunch of men, and she receives two types of data. In one case, she receives profile data. You know, what is this guy like? What is he into? Et cetera, et cetera. In the other case, some other woman has met this guy, and she can receive sort of the impressions that this woman had of this guy. So either there is direct profile data, or there is advice of sorts, just my impression of this dude. And what they find is that they ask the woman, will you enjoy the speed date, to make a forecast. Then the woman goes on the speed date and says, how much did you enjoy it? And then we look at the accuracy of their forecasts based on the two different information conditions. And it turns out that, of course, others are very helpful. There's about a 49% increase in accuracy of the forecast if your information comes from this other person than through simply reading the profile. And there's lots of reasons you can imagine. A meeting has a lot more data than just the profile data. But the interesting part of the study for me is not this condition. I mean, in this condition, it's not the forecast accuracy. They also ask people, what will help you predict which of these two pieces of data are more helpful to you? And here, about 84% believed that the profile data is more useful than the impression of this other person. This is not a unique sort of random study. This is a pretty generic finding in which, even though others and the advice of others can play a big role in shaping our preferences, shaping our information, we tend to think, yeah, that's fine, but you know what? I can really judge my own much better. And what I want to talk about quickly is why. And in fact, this is one of those phenomena that there are lots of reasons why. Let me start with the first reason. I want you all to just take a moment. I could do this by a show of hands, but well, that could lead to problems. So let me just ask you guys a question. How good of a driver are you? And I want you to think of a number between 1 and 10 which says, what decile are you in? Okay? Bottom decile, second, top decile, et cetera. Relative to the other people in this room. Okay, and how many people, don't show hands, but just think of the thought experiment. How many people put themselves in the bottom decile? I'm guessing nobody. Oh, you did? Well, just send me a text when you're going on the road. I'd like that piece of information. you can do this for a variety of questions. You can say, how good of a sense of humor do you have? We're just overconfident in our abilities. And that's a pretty generic thing. Of course, if I actually went to the restaurant, I'd have a better read. If I actually met the person, I'd be able to interpret better. And the generic sort of I can judge better leads us in lots of contexts to undervalue the importance of social information. There's another effect. Cass had pointed me to this paper. It's a terrific paper by Cohen, where here's what they did. They gave subjects a description of either a generous policy for welfare or a stringent policy for welfare. And then they told them, along with that description, Democrats' favorite or Republicans' favorite. And here is the participants' assessment of that policy as a function of their own ideology, they're liberal or conservative, as a function of whether the policy is generous or stringent, and as a function of whether Democrats favored or Republicans favored. So I'll make this easy for you. Basically, what matters in this table is if you're a liberal, you do whatever the Democrats favor. If you're a conservative, you do whatever the Republicans favor. The actual stringency of the policy does not matter in the description of it. But in the study, what's interesting, though, is you ask people, what influenced your decision? What do people say? Well, my philosophy of government, the details of the proposal. The lowest ranked is what the typical Democrat or Republican believes. That's lower ranked than my own experience with welfare participants, which people agree they don't have any. This is, again, reiterating this fact that people don't take into account and do not believe they're influenced as much by others. In this case, I think this is because of a uniqueness bias, which has been documented in a variety of cases. Yeah, I'm a Democrat, but I'm not like every other Democrat. I'm unique. Which again leads us to underestimate the influence others are going to have. All this is by way of saying, if I think of the category of the influence of others, I think there's a whole bunch of literature which points to one side, and that side of the literature is kind of well understood. Oh, others can influence my decisions. But this side, I think, is, yes, others can help, but we undervalue it. In fact, grossly undervalue it. And taking a big step back, when you look at sites like Yelp and TripAdvisor, I think there's this feeling of, oh, people are actively and eagerly seeking information from others, and there's huge demand for it. In fact, what I would argue is, yes, there's some demand for it, in cases like hotels, for example, but my guess is there's far less demand than there ought to be. And if anything, we're undervaluing this type of information, and we ought to be thinking about how do we debias this and catalyze even greater demand. So we move to a second category of the influence of others, which I think of as outsourcing self-help. What do I mean by outsourcing self-help? This is actually David's role in my life. Thanks, David. So all mistakes are really due to David. So let me start with the problem that I often have. This is a problem, the time to get up in the morning. Actually, before you read this, I'll just talk you through this problem. I want you to think about what time you woke up this morning. And I want you to think about what time you set the alarm for. And I want you to think about the difference between those. And it's an interesting difference. Like when you went to bed, you said, you know what, I'm going to get up at 6 a.m. I'm going to, I don't know, write Russian poetry, read Russian poetry, learn Russian, whatever it may be that needs you to get to that point, read the paper, or go for a jog, etc. 6 a.m. came along. 6 a.m. self said, who's this jerk who set the alarm for 6? I'd like to go to sleep. In fact, but I do know someone who'd like to get up. That's 6:07 self. I'm going to hit the snooze bar. And this is an attempt to solve that problem, which is, it's clocky. It's an alarm clock that basically what it does is, I don't know if you guys have seen this. It's actually a pretty fun alarm clock. When you hit the snooze button, it rolls off the edge of the bed, or the edge of the table, goes off into a random corner, and then starts beeping, which forces you to get up and go and find clocky. Now, this is a form of outsourcing self-help, but it's outsourcing it to a device. I actually think one of the most interesting sources of outsourcing that happen in the world is not to devices, but to people, to our friends. And I think that's an interesting form of the influence of others, especially in the world of self-control. So I'll give you a good example. There's a lot of one-on-one outsourcing that's quite interesting. Think of going to the gym. I have a student who worked on this project who had this very nice insight, which is, why do trainers work? Part of the reason they work is they're not really training you, it's that dude who's waiting for you at the gym. So you gotta go. And in some funny way, just going with a buddy already could dramatically increase your propensity to get to the gym. That's a form of outsourcing self-help. You're no longer in the morning just reliable on yourself. Now someone else is relying on you. And I'll give you another example, public commitment. If you say, I'm going to hit this particular weight goal, and you start telling everybody, well, it's a little embarrassing because you know some of those people are going to come back and say, hey, how's that going? And you don't want to constantly. Now, I'm raising this in this context because I think that in all of these cases, I think we're on the verge of technology being able to implement these things and increase the pace of outsourcing. Finding a friend to go to the gym with could be quite difficult if I have to start asking a bunch of people individually, one-on-one, can we go to the gym? It's not hard to build an app that sits on Facebook where you just say, I'm looking for a gym partner, and it can do the cross-checking across all other people who are looking for a gym partner. So there's a lot of technology, I think, that's going to be coming down the pipeline that has to do with the outsourcing of self-help. I'll give you another version, not just in the world of self-control. This is a pill bottle, for those of you who have no idea what a pill bottle looks like. And this pill bottle represents a fundamental technological problem. In the vast majority of diseases where we feel like we've had huge advances and we've kind of gotten close to beating the disease, we are left with one problem. Take HIV. We've had huge drug advances. But guess what? The drugs aren't working. And the reason the drugs aren't working, anyone have a guess? People aren't taking them. So how do you solve that adherence problem? Well, I'm going to tell you an example of a technological solution. I'm going to come back to social networks in a second. This is a company based here called GlowCaps, which is terrific. This is a pill bottle that's a technological change to this pill bottle. What it did is it changed the cap. How did it change the cap? I always think of GlowCap as kind of your passive-aggressive, needy friend. What it does is if it's not opened the right number of times that day, it starts beeping. And it starts glowing. It needs attention. And eventually it'll start sending you a text message, hey, I haven't seen you around, what's going on? And it'll keep irritating you until you open the pill bottle. Now, this is not self-control so much as it's a reminder system. And you can imagine that more than just that, adherence data across most domains shows one of the best predictors of adherence is social supports. And in fact, GlowCaps tries to take this into account. Eventually, it starts doing things like sends a weekly email update to a friend or family member that you select. But I think there's a lot of headroom left in this area. I think we could ask the question, how can we take this pill bottle and how can we take adherence and embed the problem of adherence within the social networks and the social technologies we have? So this second question that I would raise is, how can technology enable the outsourcing of self-help? I think there's a lot of room left in here. This is less about nudges and externally imposed. This is just, I need some help and I know others can help me with this self-help. Finally, how much time do I have left, David?
A minute.
A minute. Oh, I'll do this so fast. Finally, I want to talk about how others can influence us as persuasion. And here I want to talk about an interesting mistake that I've noticed. What is this? This is a great animation. Here's a billboard outside of a Brooklyn public school that's trying to get kids and others to work on the problem of high school dropout. 7,000 high school students drop out every day. That's a stack of desks 12 Empire State Buildings high. It's talking about the enormity of the problem. And you know, it's a pretty well, anyone have an idea of what's wrong with this billboard? Okay, well, I'll tell you what's wrong with it in a second. I'm going to tell you a study that is about descriptive norms. I'll go through this quickly. This is a study in which, in some conditions, some people saw a thing that said a towel on the rack means I'll use it again, and a towel on the floor means please exchange, blah, blah, blah. Guests can preserve limited water supplies. Other people saw the same thing, and then they were told 75% of the people in this room have conserved, have reused the towels. That statement, 75% of the people in this room, leads most people to reuse the towels. What does that tell you? That tells you that descriptive norms can be very powerful. What do I mean by a descriptive norm? I mean not a norm that says, not a message that says to you, you ought to do this. There is this problem. This is an important thing to do. It's a norm, it's a message that tells you lots of people are doing this. Okay, and this is, as you'll talk about in a second, Opower uses this to great effect, telling you, look, here's what your neighbors are doing in terms of energy conservation, here's what you're doing. And they find pretty big effects of this, of simply telling you what others are doing. And we'll hear more about that in a little bit. I want to contrast this to the way most people think about persuasion. Here is a Get Out the Vote description in 2004. The eminent scholar of politics, P. Diddy, talked about how only 36% of us have voted. Hillary Clinton talked about nobody has shown up amongst the young. Even John Kerry talked about, imagine if all the women who didn't vote voted, what we could have done. What's the descriptive norm being conveyed there? In an attempt to talk about the magnitude of the problem, you are conveying the descriptive norm, hey, guess what? Nobody's voting. Isn't that great? And in fact, experiments have shown that descriptive norms that emphasize no one is voting, we need your vote, are much worse for turnout than descriptive norms that emphasize lots of people are voting, you should also vote. There's a very nice study by Gerber and Rogers, which you can read, which talks about the high turnout versus a low turnout condition. This basic mistake is there everywhere, and I think that's the problem with this billboard. This is not an advertisement for going to school. This is an advertisement for dropping out. You're thinking of dropping out? Great! Look at all the other people who are with you. This is such a fundamental mistake. This is the school this is in front of. You're paying money for this activity. So I think let me just conclude by saying these are three sort of elements of psychology that I think are overlooked, and that's what I kind of wanted to do in this space. One is about, though others can help, we undervalue it. The other is about technology can actually, I think, help enable this outsourcing. And finally, on this persuasion, I think there's many, many places where we ought to focus on the use of descriptive norms, and we exactly make the wrong persuasive move. Okay, let me just stop there. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Okay, so it's a good transition to our next speaker. Michael Sachse is the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and the General Counsel of Opower, and I assume most of the people in this room know all about Opower. Opower is this spectacular application of ideas in behavioral economics and social psychology to real-world behavior in the energy setting, an effort to kind of help people better manage their energy use and not only reduce the general carbon footprint of our civilization, but also help people lower their energy bills. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how we've attempted to solve the problem of making energy data into something that actually promotes the behavior that we want people to take. And so I'd like to start with a question, which is, so I guess Senthil's talk was for like 12 minutes. So like in the last, let's say 15 minutes, how many people checked their email? All right. In the last month, how many of you took a look at your bank statement? How about your energy usage? All right, so dwindling numbers, banks are doing pretty well. But the fundamental problem that we have with energy data is that it is something that people are spending about 6 minutes a year thinking about. Now, 6 minutes a year is not going to get you very far in terms of productive thought. I can tell you that I probably spend more time each year trying to match my socks than the average American spends thinking about their energy usage. And there's a really good reason for this, and the reason is that it is both boring and confusing. It's like the magic quadrant. If you take a look at your bill, you find it pretty quickly impenetrable. And I've talked to people who design utility bills, and they also don't understand the bill other than the bills that they have themselves personally designed. But the other problem is that most people don't know what a kilowatt hour is, and even if they did know what a kilowatt hour was, they wouldn't know how to make changes that have a meaningful impact. Is the right thing to do to unplug your cell phone charger? Is the right thing to do to turn the lights off? Is the right thing to do to change the temperature in the home? There's very low awareness of these things. Again, I would say this is a big part of the reason why. Like when you look at, this does not get more insightful as you get closer to it. The energy bill is just this disaster of line items that are a reflection of a very complex regulatory system that in some ways works and in some ways doesn't, but certainly does not work to convey clear information back to consumers. And there's a dirty secret, and this is why I think this is, just for a moment, why this is an important problem. There's a dirty secret in clean energy. And the dirty secret is that everything we want to do relies on customers paying for it. I mean, that's just the fundamental model of how utilities work. They build things, we all pay for it. And so if you're talking about renewables, they want you to pay more than you're paying now because it's clean. If you're talking about the smart grid or infrastructure updates, they want you to pay. You don't know what the benefit's going to be. They can't always articulate what the benefit's going to be, but it's going to be good for you. And in sort of our business too, it's the same, right? We want consumers to pay, and we're arguing that by paying for our stuff, you're going to be paying for less of everybody else's stuff. This approach hasn't worked very well. So if you Google pitchfork-wielding mobs, you find yourself with the top hit relating to Pacific Gas and Electric's attempt to introduce smart meters. And I think this is a really telling piece of information because Pacific Gas and Electric introduced smart meters into Bakersfield, California. And the smart meters were a box that had very little data readout on it. And there was, at the time that they put them in, no charge on the bill associated with the smart meter. But they had a really hot summer. And so everybody had huge AC bills. And for the first time in recent history, there were people motivated about utility-related issues, these otherwise boring and confusing issues, because they saw their bills going up. And they blamed the smart meters, which actually had nothing to do with why their bills were going up, but they were there to be blamed. So I think that there's a big problem here that's waiting to be solved, and this is something that we've been working on, and very much using the approach that I mean, there are two ways to think of it. One way of thinking of it is, okay, people are busy, and if you want to think of them as rational actors, people are busy. These are relatively small costs overall. They're talking about small changes. And so maybe we should just assume that they're not going to have time to pay attention to them, and we should just make it easy for them. But I think the real truth of the matter is that that's not how people are thinking about these things at all. So as Senthil showed a little bit, one of the things that we've relied a lot on and had a lot of success with is contextualizing information in a way that's motivating for people. So we actually, as a company, have, we're not agnostic as to what you do with your energy use. We want you to use less. And we looked first at a study that Robert Cialdini did in San Marcos after the brownouts, and reviewing 4 different messages. One about the economic benefits of using less, one about the environmental benefits, one about the sort of civic responsibility to use less. All of those were ineffective, but the one that worked was giving a sense of peer proof, a sense of what your peers were doing. And so that's something that we've deployed on a very broad scale and in many different ways throughout our communications with customers. The second is we have a saying around our office that people don't want data. I mean, there's too much, there's a lot of data out there, and particularly when you talk to, as we do a lot, to people in the utility industry who, in many ways, are wonderful people, very bright engineers, but not always great at translating their view of the world into the way most people experience the world. They have this assumption, well, if we can just give them better data, if we could get that, that monthly data down to daily data, or that daily data down to 15-minute data, or that 15-minute data down to minute-by-minute data, and we'd produce these amazing graphs, and everyone would know exactly what to do. And there's been a number of tests in that direction that just show it doesn't work. People don't. It may work for a little bit. And I actually have a personal example here. I used a device called a Fitbit. Anyone use one of these? Yeah, I mean, like, it's pretty cool. It gives you information about, like, how many steps you've taken. It shows you can compare with your friends at how many steps they've taken. It promotes this sort of virtuous competition. But the data gets stale really quickly. Like, you don't, or at least for me it did, like, you don't vary your step taking that much day by day. You go for a run, your steps go way up. You don't go for a run, you're still within that same band. The same problem is at a much greater scale with energy data. So our view has been people don't want data. They want insight and analysis. They want someone to make it easy for them and tell them what to do, and do it in a way that is walking the line in the right way between directive and suggestive. If you tell them too strongly, they'll react badly. They won't like the message. They won't want to read it anymore. But if you don't tell them strongly enough, they won't get the direction you're trying to point them in. And I think the other thing is that the way we view this, there's you want to approach every channel possible. And one of the things that we've found exciting, and we've partnered with Facebook and NRDC on making this information available via social media, is that it turns out most people don't choose their friends by utility service territory. And so making it easy for people to connect with groups that are relevant to them, making information available through channels that people actually use, so whether it's web or mobile or text messages or paper reports, all those types of things. We think this is how you're going to start to expand the power of getting the messages right. And so just a little bit on kind of what we've seen as far as impact. We've been saving on average about 2%, 2% per household, but dealing with millions of households. And so actually earlier this month we were able to save our second terawatt hour, which means taking a city about the size of Sacramento or Kansas City off the grid for a year. And that's something we're pretty excited about, because it's what it shows is that these little changes and these little messages may not make the difference for an individual household, but they start to add up as you scale them together. And then the other thing I'd point out is that I think is really interesting is people really, when you give information to them in a way that they can understand, that is and that is motivating to them, and that uses some of the behavioral science cues we've talked about, they really value it. So it could have been the case that we would see a very small group of people taking enormous actions. Instead, we're seeing a broad group of people take fairly small actions. But then also, and the thing here that I'm most excited about, I don't know if it's legible at a distance, is that many people are saving information so that they can look back at it and sharing it either with their neighbors, via social media, if it's in a paper report, posting it on their fridge. Those are the types of little things that start to signal that there's a good conversation happening, and says to me that this is sort of like the beginning of something that can be broader. This is the beginning of a real conversation with consumers about how they're using energy. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sarah Feinberg is our next speaker. She's the Director of Corporate Communications at Facebook, and pertinent to today's conversation, she led Facebook's organ donation promotion program. She came to Facebook from the government, where she was the Chief of Staff to Rahm Emanuel, when Rahm Emanuel was the Chief of Staff to President Obama.
I'm going to give you a break from the PowerPoint slides. I thought I was going to be one of a few people who didn't give PowerPoint slides. I think I'm going to be the only person who doesn't give a PowerPoint slide, but so we'll give you a little bit of a break. So if the first panel was a lot about sort of the philosophy and academics surrounding behavior, I think this panel probably, with both what Michael was talking about and what Dr. Andy Cameron and I are going to talk about, is more sort of in the real world, what kind of actions can you take to make people actually like change their behavior, or in Cass's terms, you know, how can you nudge people in one direction or the other? And so last spring, one action that Facebook took was to give Facebook users, to give the people on Facebook the ability to share publicly or with their friends and family that they are an organ donor. And if they were not an organ donor, it gave them the ability to actually take a few steps through a tool and register to become an organ donor. So we gave people both the ability to share that they had already registered. For example, you know, I registered when I was 17 years old and got my license, or to actually take the step to register. Since then, about 500,000 people have actually gone through the tool and taken the step to share with their friends and family that they're an organ donor. I think when we launched this tool back in the spring, I think we were curious to see how many people would actually take us up on this ability. I think we've learned a bunch of lessons from it. Where do you put a tool like this? How much attention do you try to get for it? I think at this point, 500,000, when you think of the billion people on Facebook, I think it doesn't seem like very many. But I think one of the most important things about organ donation is how we think about this problem generally. And I'll sort of come back to why I think the number is important. At Facebook, we were thinking about the organ crisis as a social crisis, not as a medical crisis. So we know why people get kidney disease. We know why people need kidneys and liver transplants. There are doctors who can do those transplants. They know how to do the surgeries. It's strictly a social crisis. The only reason people die waiting for an organ is because there aren't enough organs. And so what are the reasons why there aren't enough organs? Well, people generally support organ donation, right? If you did a poll, if you asked people if they were supportive of organ donation, the vast majority would say yes. But not enough people actually become organ donors. And why is that? Well, there are a bunch of reasons. One is because typically when a person makes a decision to become an organ donor, they're at the DMV. While that's a brilliant place to register people to be organ donors, because the vast majority of people, other than in a couple places like New York City, are actually going to the DMV. So you're catching people, but you're not necessarily catching them in a moment where they're even thinking about the organ crisis or whether they want to be an organ donor. In fact, you're probably catching them in a moment where they're not thinking about that and they're grumpy anyway. Why else don't people become organ donors? This is not necessarily something that people want to think about. So unless you have a friend or a family member who's needed an organ, you may not associate organ donation with a life-saving gift. You think of it as your own mortality. And not necessarily something that you want to be thinking about. And so a lot of people don't become organ donors because it's just not a pleasant thing to talk about and to think about, and so it's not something that they take an action on and then share with people. So the more people are talking about organ donation and the organ crisis, the more there is conversations about it, the less misinformation there is, the more comfort there is in taking a step like this, the more people will actually become organ donors. And so by giving people the ability to actually share this and take this step on Facebook, we're also giving them the ability to share this information with their friends. And the average Facebook user has about 120 friends. Many have many more, some have fewer, but the average person has 120 friends. And so if you register to become an organ donor and then share that on Facebook, creates a news feed story, which your friends are seeing. And so one person registering to be an organ donor and sharing it on Facebook is then sharing that information, starting a conversation with maybe up to 120 people, sometimes fewer, sometimes more. So you are sharing that information. Your friends who are close to you, who respect you, who care about what you're doing and care about what you're sharing on Facebook, see that you've taken that action. They respect it and makes them start to think about whether, well, this is important to Sarah, maybe it should be important to me as well. So in our sort of the way we think about this, we think about the 500,000 people who've taken this step on Facebook, and then we multiply it by the 120 conversations that they've started about. organ donation, and we feel pretty good about the spikes that we've seen in state registries, the increase in online organ donor registrations, and just the amount that's being shared on Facebook. And so that's one step that we've taken. Our partner in this project was Dr. Andy Cameron, who's going to talk a little bit more about the medical side of this and some of the reaction he's seen in his community. But in terms of a nudge, as Cass would say, it's interesting when you just give people the ability to share this information. You don't preach about it. We didn't run ads about it. We just gave people the ability to share the information and how it's sort of grown from there.
Thank you. So Dr. Andy Cameron is our next speaker. He's an associate professor of surgery and the surgical director of liver transplantation at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Cameron and Cheryl Sandberg, who I believe is the CFO, am I right in, or is she
COO.
COO, sorry, at Facebook, as I'm sure, this is a Harvard alum that we're very proud of, and someone whose name is often in the press. I'm ashamed that I didn't know her actual position. Dr. Cameron and Cheryl Sandberg jointly originated the idea of using Facebook as a platform to encourage organ donation, and we'll now hear from him.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Cass, for inviting me. I really appreciate it. So I'll take 10 minutes of your time and sort of keep it as a case study here. This was something we were involved with a year ago, and it's about organ donation, and I'll do my best to bring it back to behavioral economics. This will start with the slide that every transplant talk starts with. There is a crisis in the United States right now. It's illustrated by this slide. This sloping red line is the number of people waiting for an organ transplant. It's well over 100,000. Far below it is this flat blue line. And this shows the number of donors in the United States every year for the 10 years. And as you can see, there's really been absolutely no progress in increasing organ donation over the last 10 years. And the difference between these two curves is growing. And as Sarah points out, I mean, Mass General is full of people with incurable cancers who we cannot help in 2013. This ain't that. These are people that will die for lack of a potentially available resource that we're just not sharing. That's a very odd problem. So I need 10 minutes of your time, and I need you to focus on this because I need your help with it. 117,000 people need your help. Let me take a slide or two and sort of, we got to figure this out, but we got to understand the problem. Why is there not enough organs to go around? It'll take a slide. It's, economics, supply and demand. The demand we get. There's 500,000 cirrhotics. There's plenty of alcohol. There's plenty of Hep C in the United States. There's 500,000 people on dialysis. But why is there not enough supply? Well, let's not talk about living donation. Let's just talk about deceased donation, getting people to donate their organs after they die. Now, there's 300 million people in the U.S., 2.5 million die a year, and that's a lot. That's plenty of people dying, but as you may or may not realize, I hate to be crass, but you have to die in a very certain way to donate your organs. You can't die of metastatic cancer. You can't be run over by a steamroller. You can't be shot in the head and be in the street for half an hour. You have to essentially die in the hospital and be physiologically preserved from the neck down. That leads to about 10 to 15,000 people that could potentially donate their organs. This is the problem. This is the sort of margin. The Institute of Medicine estimates that we're losing half of those people simply because at the moment of truth, they haven't specified their wishes or their family says no. So if that's 5 or 10,000 people, we get 3 organs per donor, that's 30,000 organs a year, and we can beat this wait list problem in a few years if we can get people to say yes. That's the problem that we're working on here. Now, why are we struggling with this? Why isn't everybody saying yes? What's the problem? And the answer is, on the one hand, there's not a problem. Over 100 million people have already registered, so a third of the people in the U.S. have already said yes. I mean, that's a wonderful accomplishment, signing up half the country for anything. But as Sarah reminds us, depending on how you ask the question, and when Gallup asked in 2005, 95% of the country said, well, yeah, I'm in favor of donation and transplantation. So again, people are inclined to do the right thing, but for some reason, they don't. There's some weird obstacle or inefficiency or disconnect that prevents the people that are inclined to do the right thing from doing the right thing. That's the sort of nudge over the top that we're trying to give people with this. Okay, fine. You know from personal experience that you registered the DMV. And again, the DMV system, despite multiple public health campaigns, has really been ineffective. You saw that flat blue line. Interestingly, other public health campaigns like drunk driving cessation, smoking cessation, wear your seatbelt, have been successful in a strange way that organ donation improvement has proved refractory. Last part of this. If you wanted to fix this problem, you might have to figure out why people are saying no. If you went to the DMV and rounded up 100 people who'd just been asked and they all said no, and you said, look, why did you just say no? What do you think they would say? That's sort of the question. I'm not much for audience participation, but what they would say is, you know, this is weird. This kind of hurts. You know what they say almost always? They say, I'm not going to say yes on my license because if I'm brought into the hospital and I'm sick or I'm hurt, you're not going to try hard to save my life because you want my organs because you see it on my donor card. So that speaks to, this is what we're going to have to work on. There's a profound mistrust of doctors and hospitals. They may say you're just going to give it to a drunk or a person who does drugs. They may say, as Sarah says, I don't know what I think, but I don't want to talk about this at all. I want to talk about something else, or they may say my religion doesn't allow for it, or you know, I'm too old or I'm too fat. At any rate, there is, to some extent, a need for this discussion to take place in a better environment, amongst friends, if you will. It would be great if when a moment of a public service announcement hits you, you can immediately act upon that information instead of being required to wait months or years to your next trip to the DMV. And it would be great if you could share that decision amongst other possible registrants. If only such a communication tool existed. Thank God for Facebook. So as we heard, on May 1st, Facebook decided to allow, just as you can specify where you went to college or whether you're married, you can specify that you're an organ donor. I have to say a million thanks to superhero Sheryl Sandberg, who she was the one, let's make that clear, who saw this and envisioned this and saw the power of it and explained to me, and I agreed that it was an incredible idea. Mini superhero Sarah Feinberg played a humongous role in this as well, and there's Harvard Law grad Joel Kaplan. And Mark Zuckerberg obviously had to sort of push the whole thing along. Here's a very unusual picture of him in a tie that I was able to find. That's more like it. At any rate, it allows you to link to your state registry and alert your friends, and it provides you with educational materials if you're not sure. Here's what you do. Here's my wife. Here's my timeline page. You click on organ donor over here in health and wellness. It gives you this box to fill in. It gives you a link for more information. You get the link to your state registry. This is Donate Life America. You click on your state. Takes you 2 minutes. It's free, of course, and then you're official. And it sends you a message to all your friends. That's the whole idea. That was the whole big thing. So let me take a minute of your time and show you what happened. All right, so we had to assay all donor state registries to see if there was an uptick in registration, and they sent us what happened for the first 2 weeks after May 1st when Facebook made this small, subtle change in its timeline platform. We had, thanks to Brian Stewart for giving us the data from 44 registries, my friends at Hopkins for helping me. So on the first day that it came out, May 1st, online organ donation registration went up 2,400% in the United States. And this was a problem that for 20 years we hadn't been able to touch. Now, as we also learned this morning, online viral campaigns can kind of come and go within hours. And within, looking at the first week, there was still a 10-fold increase in organ donation, which is unusual. Even at the end of the data we had after 2 weeks, it was still up 600%. It was good. This is a heat map of the United States. Some states were fantastically green in terms of how much they went in terms of their organ donation registration. Some were sort of less green, pea green. Let me show you a couple of them. Georgia, the great state of Georgia, I guess from where peaches come. The first day went up 12,000%. I don't even know what that number means. What it mostly means is that donation in Georgia was absolutely horrible before we started this. And that's maybe part of the message too. A week later, it was still 6,000%. And after 2 weeks, it was still 500% up. That was the activity then. Maryland, where I'm from, home of second place Johns Hopkins. I've been told now Mass General is the best hospital in the country. Nothing second place about the Baltimore Ravens, I'll show you that. We went up about national average 2,400%, stayed there, and after 2 weeks it was still double. Massachusetts data, your state, was collected as a whole with New England, so I'll give you that as your state flag, although I'll also give you Tom Brady. Here's a picture of Tom Brady giving Ed Reed a karate chop, which we didn't appreciate. Donation went up in New England 4,000% and stayed sky high. All right, let me show you one more state where things didn't go as well. We essentially have 50 case studies now to understand how better to model this tool and get it to work. We got to look at the states where it didn't work as well. Hawaii, home of some of our absolute favorite things. If you don't believe it, there's the birth certificate to prove it. First day it went up 800%. Only, this is the worst state in the country. We need to figure out why. Only, but again, for a problem that we hadn't made any progress on in 20 years, it only went up 800%. We'll work on it. After 2 weeks, it was back to baseline. All right, a couple slides to close, and here's my hand at behavioral economics. So why it worked, unless you live in a cave, Facebook is kind of everywhere. So why do we use the DMV? Because 200 million people in the US drive a car and have a driver's license. Why don't we use Facebook? 200 million people in the US are on Facebook. It's kind of the same thing as the DMV. It was this immediate opportunity where when it hit you that this was a good idea to do, you could immediately act upon it. I think that's very important. It was this notion that it wasn't Big Brother asking you for your organs. It was your friends. You listen to what they say about movies or music. Start thinking about this too, because they're starting to talk about it. And also, it's sort of lasted. There was this notion of when you make this choice, it reinitiates the discussion amongst your 120 friends. It was this sort of nudge. There was no draconian punishment if you didn't do it. It was just a reminder. It sort of recognized people as humans, not econs. They make potentially bad choices or choices based on myths or misconceptions, and you've got to treat them as people that may not be making good decisions. It also recognized social norms. It was an attempt to get people thinking, all my friends are doing this, isn't it something I should be considering? There was also an emotional nudge in that when you did it, when you made the play to register as a donor on Facebook, everybody saw that and everybody liked that. And you were sort of then recognized as a good person for having done it. Now this is maybe the most important part. Why, we didn't cure the organ donation problem on May 1st, much to my disappointment. We got to keep working on it, and this is where I need your help. These are some of the reasons, in my opinion, why it didn't work better, and some of them sort of come from behavioral economics. Number one, we didn't utilize defaults. And Facebook doesn't know I'm going to say all this stuff, but this is just my sort of take on what happened. It's not that when you woke up on May 1st, all 200 million people were all signed up for organ donation, and you had to then go to Health and Wellness and Organ Donor and unsign up. That we could have done it that way, we being Facebook, and I am awfully grateful to Facebook for this. But we didn't do this. And that led probably to less of a response, I would guess. We didn't even employ mandated choice, which may have been a really good idea. And they'll probably want to get a cane and take me off here. But what if when you logged on to Facebook for 3 weeks, you couldn't really get to your homepage unless you had to click the yes or no? You had to pick. If we had done that, which I think they had absolutely no interest in doing for very good reasons, I think we would have signed up 100 million people. Or we would have gotten some chunk of that 95% that say they want to do it. We would have made them say, yes, I'm an organ donor type of guy. And it would have helped those 117,000 people that are waiting. We didn't utilize incentives either. And this is I think, is crucially important. it would be a whole nother day to talk about whether we should pay people for donating their organs, and it would be a fascinating conversation. But we're not going to get into that. Way too controversial, way too difficult. We're not talking about paying people for their organs. We're not even talking about paying people for registering, which might be okay. We're talking about rewarding people for declaring that they are a donor on Facebook. Just like you like Cold Stone Creamery or you like the Chipotle page and you get $1 off, it may be a very good idea to tie the I registered for donation to $1 off Cold Stone, in my opinion. I think that may lighten the message some, because people aren't that comfortable talking about what's going to happen to them after they die. But they're super psyched to get that $1 off at Chipotle, to my surprise, when I go on Facebook. 100,000 people are doing that, you know. So I think that's one thing to consider. And I think that would move people, and I think that would keep it viral. So I think I'll just say, you know, again, Facebook is rolling this out to the entire world. There is soon going to be 1 billion people that have easy access to declaring whether they want to donate their organs. This, for us in transplant, is a historic thing. These are the countries it's already hit. When it gets on your mobile phone, you can't do it on your phone right now. I think that's going to be huge. I'm talking to you, nobody's really listening to me. You're all like talking on your phones right now. I foresee, you know, somebody coming out at halftime of the Celtics game and saying, I had a transplant and not a dry eye in the house. All you got to do is whip out your phone, and 3 buttons later, you say yes. That's how it's going to work. People need that type of attention span. Last thing is we need to integrate with these 100 million people that have already signed up. We've already talked about it. If you have a voter registration drive and you sign 1 person up, that's really good. If they wear a flag pin around, you get 4 more people that same day. I want people in the DMV that take everybody that just said yes, they hand them an iPod and they say, go tell everybody on Facebook that you just did that. I don't want their 1 yes, I want their 120 friends. I could even imagine using, you know, the new graph search to say not friends from New York or whatever, but friends that said yes to organ donation. This is more about social norms. If 30% of your friends said, you know, 30% of my friends do this, how come I'm not doing it? I think we could get some leverage there. I'm going to quit with this. This is the problem. Okay, so it's real for us. Those lines are getting further apart, and I'll leave you with one last number. 18 is the number of people that will die today, February 5th, for lack of transplantable organs. So I really I thank you for your attention, but we badly, badly need your help with this problem. And Facebook has taken a giant, huge step for this, and we're really grateful for that. It was very clever.
So let me begin with Sendel's talk, and I'm just commenting in real time. I didn't have access to the presentations ahead of time. So Sendel emphasized the point that peer advice is very powerful, and we don't completely recognize the strength of that powerful advice. And I want to kind of offer a twist on that. We might want to recognize the power of that advice so we can get more of it, because it's going to help us make better decisions. That's kind of an economic perspective. Advice contains information. Information is useful. We'll make better choices if we get that advice, and we should recognize how valuable it is. We should have interventions that help people recognize it. An alternative interpretation is that peer advice is very powerful and often very toxic, and maybe frequently very toxic. That it influences us, it pulls us, it drives us, and we end up hurting in ways that are actually socially damaging. Now, of course, there are special cases that go in both directions, and we want to think about kind of where, on average, does the evidence lie. Some of you may know this wonderful ASH experiment that goes back to the 1950s, where subjects were basically shown 2 lines, one long and one short, and the experimenters went around the room and said, which one is longer? And the first subject gave what was obviously the wrong answer. And the second subject gave what was obviously the wrong answer. And then you got to the 5th subject, who was the only actual subject. The previous 4 subjects were all Confederates. And what did the 5th subject say? The wrong answer. So here's a case where peer advice is very powerful, and probably people don't recognize it, just as Sendel showed us. And we worry that that peer advice can sometimes lead us to hurt in ways that are damaging. So we want to kind of get a subtle understanding of, and here I'm thinking we're probably in agreement of when peer advice gives us information that helps us make better decisions, and when peer advice creates toxic herding. For another insight on that set of issues, I want to refer everyone to a wonderful new paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics by Stefano Della Vigna, John List, and Enrico Malmandier, showing how peer advice is perceived when it's in the form of trying to fundraise for a good cause as unwelcome by a shockingly high fraction of people. So they don't want the option of being able to donate to a good cause. They don't want to be asked. They'd rather avoid even the question. So some thoughts on Sendel's presentation. Let me turn to Michael's presentation from Opower. So at Opower, there's this fantastic result that by showing people peer benchmarks, and these are anonymous peer benchmarks. These are just people in your neighborhood, people you don't know. Now, so it's not even like, my friend, it's people in the general vicinity. They've managed to reduce energy use by 2%, which is the equivalent, I now understand, of taking a pretty large city off the grid for a year. And of course, this is expanding. So, fantastic. But let me now contextualize that, think about the boundaries of that effect, and tell you about another study that I did with John Beshears, James Choi, and Bridget Madrian. So reading the same literature that motivated Opower, Cialdini's wonderful work, we thought we can get people to save more. And so we found a firm where the vast majority of people in the firm were saving in their 401k plan, 90% participation rate at this firm. But there was 10% who weren't saving. So we did a randomized control study. Some people got a letter saying, there's a savings plan, please use it. It's great. Others got the same exact letter with one line inserted that said, and 90% of your coworkers are currently saving in the plan. What do you think that information did to workers at this firm who were members of the union? Drove down their savings. They joined at a lower rate after hearing that 90% of their coworkers were in the savings plan. And we had lots of sources of variation that produced the same pattern. When we varied the peer comparison, so it wasn't 90, but it was 80%, and we did that without lying to anyone by basically telling them about different demographic groups, we again got the same effect. The higher the number of their peers that were in the savings plan, the less likely they were to join the plan when we were randomly varying this information. So peer effects clearly work sometimes. In fact, I think they clearly work much of the time, maybe most of the time, but we don't yet know when they have the positive effect, which Opower's been measuring, and when they have these perverse effects that we measured. Now let me turn to Sarah and Andy and this, extraordinary work that is clearly already saved, in terms of I'm banking the organs now, thinking ahead over the next few decades, it's going to save thousands of lives. One of the amazing disappointments about this work that Andy hinted at as we got to the end of his presentation is that those, and I just learned this on the web during the first presentation. I would have talked about it with you earlier, but I learned about it during the first session, looking up the kind of web record of how this all succeeded, is that there was this enormous spike during the first few weeks. And that's the data that you saw. But if you go out 2 or 3 months, you're back to baseline. So all of the action, at least according to those on the web, there's a few papers you can read, occurred in those first few weeks in terms of registrations. And when you get out to 3 months, you're back to baseline in terms of the frequency of people in general in the US going to the registration sites and signing up, and these baselines are horrific. So that's why Andy was telling you about this great struggle that we have with millions of people dying each year in the US, and yet this woefully inadequate donation rate and unnecessary deaths because we can't find donors, and this remarkable experiment at Facebook where we do have this enormous success in terms of this spike in behavior change, but it must generate, I'm trying to do the numbers in my head during your talk, about 100,000 new registrations during the spike period, ballpark. Maybe you've done a calculation like that. And then we're back to baseline 3 months later. So there's no new registrations, out 3 months in the future. So they managed to do something remarkable, but it didn't persist in terms of creating a national conversation. or at least a national conversation that can be measured in terms of Facebook signups. So I think there's something very remarkable and exciting happening here, which is we're beginning to learn what is working and what's not working and where the boundaries of these effects are. And obviously what we want to do is leverage what we learned so that the next round is that much more effective. And I really liked a lot of the ideas that Andy threw up in terms of how to take this to the next stage by using things like mandated choice and incentives and maybe even defaults, which may be a bridge too far. I'm not sure some Americans would be comfortable if they found out they'd been defaulted into it. But anyway, I'm enormous fan of this experiment, and clearly they've already had a great success, and we want to figure out how to leverage it into an ongoing flow. So let's pause here and open it up for questions. Max.
Hi, Max Baseman from the Harvard Business School. This is one of the best panels I've many years. So thank you all. And Sarah and Andy, thanks for doing what you do. It's spectacular, and I've never learned how to use Facebook, but you've motivated me to get on the Facebook page so I can make my organ information more public. My question follows up on David's last point, and that is with the 95% data point, and with what you're doing, and with the pretty high visibility of the Johnson-Goldstein study on defaults, why aren't we able to take this information and mobilize the change in government to change the default, which would create an enormous impact? And I don't know if that question is for you, Sarah, coming out of government, or for Sendel or Cass, who have also been in government. But it feels mind-boggling that we're at such an inappropriate default based on the government's policies, given everything else that we hear in this arena.
Well, I think it's a couple things. I mean, and I think there are a lot of people in this room who would suggest and believe that the law of the land should be that you are automatically an organ donor unless you take some action that you're not going to be. I think people believe that's a very personal choice. And I'm not sure, look, I'm personally supportive of it. I'm personally an organ donor, obviously, but I think you would be hard pressed to find members of Congress who believe that that's something that the country would want. It's interesting. We've Andy mentioned it. We've launched this tool in I think 18 or 19 countries now. There are some European countries that are baseline opt-out. So you are opted in unless you take an action to opt out. It's interesting. And when we work very carefully with all of the governments wherever we're launching this feature to make sure that we're launching it in the right way, and we have good relationships with health ministers, and that we're not stepping on toes, and that we're doing things that will actually be helpful in terms of inadvertently causing any harm. And in some of those countries where you're on an opt-out basis as opposed to an opt-in basis, the government actually said, it's actually not that helpful for you to come in and launch this tool in this country, because we're in a good place. We've got very few people are opting out. If you come in and get a bunch of attention to the fact that everyone's opted in, you're actually not going to help yourselves. You're just going to draw attention to the fact that people, may not have realized that they were opted in, and then they're going to choose to opt out. And so, I think Europe has done a great job of being incredibly progressive with their laws, but I think people still very much believe this is a personal decision, and not necessarily something that they want the government to decide for them, and not necessarily something, if the government has decided, the government wants them to start reconsidering either.
Quick follow-up on that. If you want to measure how well you're doing in terms of organ donation in Poughkeepsie, New York, or Spain, or Switzerland, you measure donors per million recovered, and that's a hard number. And almost anywhere you go, it's about 20 per million. And the winner, the best country in the world at this, is Spain. And the so-called Spanish miracle is thought to be due to an opt-out policy. In Spain, you're a donor unless you have, the piece of paper that says otherwise. So that speaks to your question. Let me give two caveats to that. Number one, talking to a bunch of Spanish surgeons and hearing them present about it, it's a chicken and an egg thing, in that Spain has done it. They didn't just pass a law one day and say, too bad, we get your organs. They have a wonderful public health culture in Spain where they have gone hospital to hospital, intensive care unit to intensive care unit, and done outreach and education and got the country educated and behind it to the point where it was feasible to pass a law that nobody had a problem with. So it wasn't that they passed a law, it's that they'd already done all the homework and everybody was for organ donation in Spain. When somebody dies in Spain, they don't come and take the organs. They talk to the family and ask for permission, just as they do in the United States. So Spain has an opt-out policy. They have the highest organ donation rate of any country in the world, but I still think it comes back to educating people, conversation in the right environment, and getting people to go for it. It is just my opinion, but I don't think we will ever get to a point in the United States where we are doing something that there's some sense that people don't want us to be doing. We're not going to go, as doctors, take people's organs out if there's a family member saying, I don't want this, I don't want you to do it. If we did that, the fracturing of the public trust would be so great that we would not recover. We're already fighting an uphill battle against you just want to take our organs for whatever. We need to have a collaborative effort which still respects people's right to choose. That's my sense of the way the winds blow.
So I would,
I was just going to say, I think that it points to, because this is something we see as well, there's a question about how good or honest or accurate people are about expressing their preferences. And one of the things I thought about when I saw your presentation was maybe 95% of the people don't want to be organ donors. They just don't want to say that. And that's something we see all the time, in that when we've used surveys many times to try to figure out what people are doing, and they report preposterous things. Like that we can look at the data and say, there's no way you replaced your refrigerator. Like, it is the same. But they will swear to us they replaced the refrigerator. So I think there may be, that would be something I'd be very interested to know, if there was if you got different responses based on when and how the question was asked.
It's a great point. And if you ask people, you're absolutely right. If that was when people were asked, are you for transplantation and donation? And you're right, 95% say yes. If you ask people, do you intend to donate your organs when you die? Then it's only 70%. If you had a child that needed an organ, would you be willing to donate that child? Then it's 95%. So it is very important how you ask. And when it's Big Brother at the DMV and you're hot and you're tired and you're pissed off because you've been in line for 2 hours, you're 60% say no, get lost. But when it's hopefully your friend saying, then it's different. But it is important not to gloss over that, I agree. And that it is a complicated topic. It's not as easy as you should wear your seatbelt. There's really no discussion to be had. And there are going to be some people who've also thought about it very clearly and don't want to donate their organs. And that's okay too. We're not here to try and talk them down either. You got to respect that and say, that's beautiful. You don't have to.
I think I'm more optimistic about a policy solution. I agree with everything you're saying. I think the idea of a default or a federally imposed default it's not going to happen. But I think, David, you've worked on this. I think the idea of active choice is far more feasible, and state level, Illinois has done this to some extent. And I think states could very easily impose legislation that simply just said, well, at the DMV, you have to choose one way or the other. You can't simply fail to choose. That, I think, is a very low hurdle to go over. I don't think that's going to get everybody through, but even if that gets 25% of the people through, I think that's useful. I think the main barrier as to why that hasn't happened it's simple. I think it's just money. It's a state level issue. You need some lobbying done state by state. And we're not talking about a lot of money, but state legislators aren't out there looking for small innovations that they're going to implement. You need some megaphone. My own feeling is that's the cheapest, lowest hanging fruit we have because state level lobbying is not very expensive. It's not lobbying, it's just getting model bills in front of legislators and saying this would be an easy bill to pass and getting support around that. I actually think something like that could happen with some amount of funding.
Well, and to be clear, cheap, low-hanging fruit actually would make a lot, would get us there. I mean, would get us a lot of the way there. There aren't millions and millions of people dying every year in this country because they don't have because they don't get an organ that they need. It's thousands of people, and so, you know, the laws in a lot of these states are absolutely archaic. The fact that we have 50 different laws governing, governing registration is insane. New York, which you would think would be ahead of the curve, is the worst state in the country on this because they actually require that you print something out, sign it, and like notarize it and send it back, which is like 1982 kind of stuff. And to Governor Cuomo's credit, he's very interested in changing that, but it's also like where on your list of priorities is that? So. And you know, and Andy's data, you know, the data related to this is not perfect either because we know how many people have used the tool on Facebook, but because this is such a fractured, because all the laws are different in every country or in every state, we then have to count on the state registries to report in a timely manner, usually to Donate Life America, what their registrations have been, and then for Donate Life America to then get the data to us and for us to actually look at it. And so, you know, I mean, my home state of West Virginia didn't even report, like just chose not to tell anyone how many people have become, you know, registers, have chosen to register there in the last, in that month section. So these are good people, like in terms of, the DMV has done the Lord's work in terms of getting people registered. I mean, I have huge respect for them, but you know, the laws in a lot of these states are archaic and make absolutely no sense, and then you also are dependent on someone actually being responsive and turning over numbers when they've got a lot of other priorities. But low-hanging fruit would actually, you know, get us there. Doesn't have to be sweeping.
So one other virtue of active choice is that, as Andy pointed out, when you get to the hospital, the family members end up making the decision in the vast majority of cases, and it's very important that they know what the family member wanted, which is conveyed in active choice, as opposed to a default where family members may say, well, that just happened automatically, I don't know actually what Dad really wanted for himself. But wonderful open questions. I know we could go for another hour with all the questions that are probably bubbling up here, but I'm going to try to keep us on schedule. We're already 5 minutes late. So let's end this session and thank the speakers for a terrific session.